So we're going to wrap up this look at kind of Jewishness and Judaism, this identity and tradition so rooted in the exile and the diaspora, the promise of the call to be God's people, and how that plays out in modern Judaism ethically and practically, and the challenges for identity that it creates for Jews, and the challenges for the religion of Judaism, and the challenges of distinguishing between kind of heredity and tradition. So we've talked a lot about the kind of the core things for the Abrahamic traditions, right? God is transcendent. He's absolutely other, but he's involved in this world. There's a concern for others. There's a celebration of life and creation is good. We saw that in all the practices of Judaism. Those first three we see as kind of the basis historically of the ethics of Judaism. We see this reasoning together and this contending. We can even see that in the structure of the Talmud itself and the importance of kind of discursive reasoning for coming to an understanding of what God would have us do and think about the world, ideas of natural law, and then human reason and human free will. These are all, we see some of this in all the Abrahamic traditions, but we hopefully have seen it very specifically within the tradition of Judaism as it plays out. But probably the most difficult thing to deal with in the modern world for modern rabbinic Judaism is, what does it mean to be a chosen people in a world that so focuses on equality and tries to downplay difference and look for kind of shared humanity, discourages any idea of a specialness, right? This idea that you're special somehow as a group is discouraged. So how do you deal with this kind of call to be the chosen people and what that means? What does it mean to be the people of God? Christianity is going to deal with it in a very radical way, but how do modern rabbinic Jews deal with this? Is it to be a priestly people? We've talked about that a little bit. We talked about Moses Mendelssohn, right? Mendelssohn said, well, we're a priestly people in that we stand out with special rules in order to bring attention to God and his ways, but really it's about personal responsibility, natural law, and you don't have to become Jewish, you don't need to become Jewish. We Jews are here to set a special example. And the problems for Mendelssohn, or we saw, was like none of his grandkids were Jewish. They all converted to Christianity because it was just easier. And I shouldn't say that. We don't know that that's why, but it would seem to be that's part of it. If you don't have to be specifically Jewish to relate to God, if you can relate to God through natural law and just maintaining personal responsibility and recognizing that there is one God who made the world, why do you need all this kosher stuff? Why do you need these special laws? Especially since the temple and the sacrificial system's gone, so many of the purity laws become impossible. So why bother? What do you do with that? Well, Jeffrey Radin is a rabbi. He says traditional Judaism is a religion not in the sense of a faith commitment, but in the orthoprax, correct practice sense of a culture and way of life of the Jewish people. Not faith in God nor any other faith commitment defines one as a Jew, and among the Jewish people there are those who define themselves as religious and those who define themselves as secular. There are in Judaism different streams: Orthodox, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Reform, and Secular, and different approaches within each stream. But what defines one as a Jew is being born to a Jewish mother or having converted. And what unites Jews is not a faith commitment, but being part of a people with a shared history, language, land, and culture or way of life. Sounds interesting, sounds thorough, but there's a problem even within what he says. If it's an orthopractice rooted in a culture and a shared language and a shared history, how do you convert, right? A Jewish mother or having converted. How do you convert to a shared history, land, and language, culture, and way of life? What does it mean to convert to a shared history, language? I mean, how is that even possible? So even in trying to kind of work this out by saying, well, it's not about belief, it's just about practice. But if that practice is not rooted in belief, then what's the point of the practice? And if it's a culture, how do you convert to a culture? Especially in this day and age when we talk about appropriation, cultural appropriation. And I mean, is this even, what would a Jew do about that? How do you deal with that? Many rabbis would discourage people from converting to Judaism, in part because there's this difficulty of what does it mean to convert? And is it really true that belief in God doesn't matter? The whole ethical system of the Jews is rooted in the idea of a God who creates. So what do you keep if you get away with that? Do away with that? Ethics for the Jews historically has been ethics in the image of God. Morality and ethics rests on a foundation of ethical monotheism. God is one and only God who is perfectly right and righteous. Good world is created to live in conformity with God's nature and will, so that natural law that Mendelssohn spoke about at least makes a little more sense in relation to the historical kind of tradition of Judaism, rooted in the image of God, and God is created. And humans created in God's image, a special creation. We have to treat humans, other humans, in a certain way because they're made in the image of God. And they have moral impulses, and they have to make decisions between good and evil. What does all that mean if you do away with that belief, like Radon suggested? We saw Jewish practices rooted in the Sabbath and holy days. That's part of that identity, but what's the point of that identity? What is a holy day if you have no God? What's the point of a Sabbath if there's no basis for the Sabbath in creation, in the law, in the calling of God? What is the point of, and again, how do you convert to all this? We know of people who kind of maintain certain cultural identities within a community, but you wouldn't convert to that, right? I mean, you might enjoy, I enjoy Ethiopian food and Ethiopian music. I'm not exactly going to convert to an Ethiopian. What would that mean? If Jeffrey Radin is right, how do I convert? I can't convert and I can't now have a Jewish mom, and my mom's not Jewish. So this is a difficulty. This is the challenge for Jewish identity and the question for Judaism as a faith. What does it mean? It's an internal struggle. You will find, Jeffrey Radin said what he says, but you'll find rabbis who are very strongly opposed to what he said. And there are reasons for that in this modern world. The reason he can say that is because Jews have existed under foreign rule and often under persecution. And so it's easy to look at trying to hold to a culture together as kind of the basis of what it means to be Jewish. We had Jews under Islamic rule throughout much of history and they're often persecuted and marginalized, but they do have a protected status. For most of their history under Christians, the same way they're marginalized, but there's usually a protected status. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux argued for the protection of the Jews. Saint Augustine of Hippo, two very prominent Christian theologians and teachers, argued for protecting the Jews. There were outbreaks of persecutions, oftentimes rooted in financial issues more so than religion, where people in power would turn the common people against a community of Jews out of kind of greed. That happened in the Middle East as well from time to time. Under both Islam and Christianity, you had a certain level of anti-Semitism. You have a certain level of persecution, a certain level of I think the one thing you see more prominent under Christian rule that you don't see quite as often in Islamic places is expulsions, which happen fairly frequently. This often had to do with the fact that Christians weren't allowed to lend money to each other, so the Jews became kind of the banking system, because they could lend to Christians on interest. And what happens when somebody powerful gets into a lot of debt and the person they're in debt to has no real power. They live in a community that's a minority community. Well, suddenly the whole community can be out of favor and expelled from the land, and his debt's wiped clean. So there's some real problems for Jews in the European context. It's not always rooted. The problems aren't always rooted in religion so much as they are oftentimes in economics. Within Islam, Jews have to pay a much higher tax, and as long as they did that, most Muslim leaders were not interested in persecuting them because they're a source of income, a source of wealth. But definitely not, to expel them. They were often a source of education and wealth. So many Muslim leaders saw expulsion as a sort of not a smart thing to do. You see under both Christian and Islamic rule, you see a rise in mystical Judaism as a reaction to persecution. So there's definitely persecution of Jews. That shapes them, as we've talked about before. That shapes their development of their kind of vocation in the world. It shapes their development of their ethical system, and it shapes the kind of sense of a tight-knit community in a foreign land. But how do you convert to that, right? We see all these expulsions. I'm wondering, this time no one's going to convert. But what does it mean to be Jewish under such instances? Because one way to avoid being expelled was often to convert to Christianity. It wasn't an ethnic expulsion, it was a religious expulsion. We don't trust you, or we owe you money. So but if you became a Christian, then we couldn't owe you money with interest because you weren't allowed to give money on interest. If you became a Christian, we could now trust you as long as you were a true Christian, right? So that for Jews, it's a difficulty. There's an ethnic, there's a familial, community connection, and yet there's this religious connection. And which one? How does that work together? What does that do? It creates real challenges for Jews living under other powers and under rulers, other religious systems. Even once you see kind of Jews beginning to be freed from kind of systemic persecutions, there's still, in the 1800s, there's anti-Semitism. But this, when you get into the modern era, the 1800s, it's based in ethnicity. Suddenly becoming a Christian doesn't help you like it did before. It's not just your beliefs, it's your ancestry. This is rooted in early evolutionary theories in Darwinism, where racial politics were rooted in ideas of kind of biological developments. One race was seen as higher than another race, which is an evolutionary. Darwin was very prominent in kind of promoting the idea of superior races. There were movements for eugenics, like we're going to breed the higher race, we're going to breed the Superman. And certain races, by virtue of who their parents were, by what their bloodline was, were seen as less of a, less intelligent, less valuable. With the modern era, that's kind of what develops in this kind of ethnic idea that usurps the value of kind of religious and political loyalties. That leads to early rise in Zionism. Zionism is this idea that the Jews ought to immigrate, to move back into a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But this creates greater tension with the Muslim world. Many Jews had lived in relative peace, though with some kind of limits and kind of tougher conditions, but had lived in relative peace under Arab rulers. But once Jews started moving back into Palestine trying to set up a Jewish homeland, you begin to see some serious backlash among Arabs and Muslims against the Jews, more so than you had for a while. Things get more difficult. But these are European Jews, right? There had been these kind of native Jews that had lived in the Middle Eastern regions for a long time. But when these European Jews come in and try to set up a Jewish homeland, that Zionism creates some real tensions. When we get to the Holocaust, this builds on Hitler and the Nazis. They'll use ideas from earlier anti-Jewish writers of a Christian bent, of a Christian background. They'll use some religious language, but they apply it ethnically. So whereas, a writer from the 1500s may have said something negative about Jews, that writer was referring to someone of a religious belief. Because of this kind of vagueness of, is this a religion, is this an ethnicity, and the prominence of ethnicity and desire to, kind of breed a better human being, and the idea of we're the superior race, and this sort of racism that comes with the modern world. Some of those religion-based discriminations get kind of transferred into these ethnic ideas and support Hitler's moves for ethnic purification, for anti-Semitic laws. That comes to the idea of this final solution to what's called the Jewish question. That Jewish question is, what does it mean to be Jewish? How does your identity relate to your religion, relate to our identity as a nation? Can you really fit in? Can you really be one of us? Can you be loyal? Can you be trusted? Besides the fact that you're probably pretty steeped, or likely, or possibly pretty steeped in the banking community, because for so long Christians couldn't lend to each other on interest. People owe you money, so that the Jews get held up as part of the problem. They're the reason so many, in Germany, these Jewish bankers are the reason that so many good, noble Christian German soldiers can't, they lost an arm in World War I, and they can't survive. They're starving out there while these, Jews are getting fat on our misfortune. That's the kind of language that the Nazis would use to kind of perpetrate their genocide. But it's a little, it draws on the religious without making the distinction, when what it's really pointing at is the ethnicity. The Nazis themselves were anti-Jewish. They were also anti-Christian. If you look at their writings, their more private ideas, Hitler hated Christianity, but he used it to his benefit, and sadly, certain segments of the Christians, or supposed Christians in Germany, went along with it, though there were a good number of devout Christians who resisted and gave their lives in rejection of the Nazis' movements against the Jews. This is important. It's so important to understand the Holocaust and its aftermath, because it shapes the way Jews understand their place in the world. It shapes the way they understand their faith in God. It shapes and intensifies the question of what it means to be Jewish. It also kind of probably misshapens the way we read ancient texts and ancient disagreements and difficulties and persecutions, because we tend to read, like I mentioned before, we tend to read a persecution that happened in 450 under the Romans as the same thing that's happening in the Holocaust, and they're very different things. We need to understand they're different so we can understand the dangers really of both and how to avoid both. If we conflate them and think they're the same thing, we can miss some important distinctions in avoiding things like that in the future. So we had concentration camps. You have 6 million Jews killed. There are German Christians that do risk death by opposing the government. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. There's several other like heroes, kind of devoted Christian heroes, and others who resist the Nazis from within Germany. But what is this what did this Holocaust do for Judaism? Well, some Orthodox Jews saw it as a punishment or a test of faith, or an opportunity to die for God, to be the sacrifice. That word Holocaust has to do with a sacrifice. Some mystical movements of Judaism saw kind of those who died in the Holocaust as a being themselves a sacrifice to God for the salvation of the world. Others obviously respond by rejecting God, which is part of this struggle for identity. If you want to maintain your Jewish identity, but you no longer believe in God, what do you do with that? How do you do that? Within modern Judaism, you have these reform movements that just promote kind of Judaism as a pure ethical monotheism. Think back to what we talked about with Mendelssohn. There's that kind of natural law. It's the foundation for a reasoned ethics based on the idea of an ordered universe made by a good God. Orthodox rabbis tend to hold more firmly to the Talmud as the interpreter of the scripture, and try to maintain a much more strict kind of following of the more ancient traditions, going back to after that temple destruction in 70. This rabbinic Judaism, this kind of long-standing tradition of the Talmud and the place of the rabbis. One very influential Jewish writer is Martin Buber. He wrote I and Thou. He identifies two different types of relationships between the self and the world. And this is rooted in that idea of God as one God who creates, and your kind of responsibility is to learn to relate properly to the thou, to the other selves, and to the its, the created order, the things, and to distinguish rightly between the objects and the subjects. Right? It's God being a perfect subject, another human being being another subject, a rock or a tree, or your car being an object. How do you relate properly to these things? And that's this kind of personal responsibility, the recognition of the value of the other as rooted in being created in the image of God, and the importance of the relationship to God himself as another subject. So all these are kind of challenged and challenge what Jeffrey Radin says in this idea of orthoprax Judaism. How do you have this practice without having this belief? How can he say that? The statistics seem to argue that you can't. This is from Pew in 2013. 9 in 10 American Jews born before World War II identify themselves as Jewish by religion, but nearly a third of Jewish millennials, people born after 1980, identify as having no religion at all. So what does it mean to be Jewish if you're no longer of a religious bent? Among Jews who married before 1971, only 17% were married to non-Jews. Those married after 2000, 60% married people who weren't Jewish. Here again, if you're not going to be strict about a belief system and you're going to talk about a heritage and an ancestry, when 60% of your people are marrying people who aren't Jewish, how do you maintain that heritage and that ancestry? How do you hold to that? Especially considering this next point, that 80% of Jews who marry outside the faith consider themselves not to be religious. And nearly 2/3 are not raising their kids as religiously or culturally Jewish. Right? So this is why many rabbis right now, especially conservative or Orthodox rabbis, are very much emphasizing, if you're Jewish, you need to practice the faith. You need to live out this religion. This is part of who we are, and it becomes so central to the identity for the devout, because they're kind of losing their heritage. So it would seem like Jeffrey Radin's view that that it's just a practice, it's a culture, it's a language. If that's the case, it's going to disappear. Interestingly, though, nearly 70% of all those who interviewed, whether they identified as religious or not, said they participated in a Passover Seder, and more than half said they fasted during Yom Kippur. So you have these two holidays, these two markings of time that are important. But there again, you got to ask yourself, is that just, how many people celebrate Christmas who aren't particularly Christian, that don't really think about its religious elements at all, aren't concerned with it, would dismiss the religious side of it as unimportant? Does Passover become that? It's just one more kind of cultural connection. And if so, will that eventually die out? Because it's obviously not going to be as ingrained in as large of a segment of the culture. If the rest of the surrounding culture is celebrating Christmas and Easter, even if they lose the religious meanings of those, are you able to really maintain Hanukkah and Passover that happen around the same times? So those are the questions that modern Jews have to deal with, and that's some of the challenges that we see happening in the modern world with the Jewish faith. Obviously, the Orthodox, the conservative, Orthodox and conservative Jews, and even many Reform are going to say, no, our religion is important to who we are. We can't just separate ourselves from our God. So, some other quick points, and this will wrap up this section, but there are some various kind of reactions to the modern world that started before kind of the modern world, but they take root and they really seem to thrive because they're a rejection of the modern world in some sense, and they're an internalizing of sort of this Jewish faith to the non-rational experience of God. They focus mystically on God as a structured being. They emphasize messianic redemption. The Hasidism is a Jewish mystical movement that stresses kind of emotional connections to God with very traditional practice. It's this almost messianic movement of kind of inward messianism, transformation and direct relationship to God in this mystical experience of the Jewish faith, of the Jewish God. When we talk about Hasidism and Orthodox Jews, this is maybe your images you'd be commonly see. This is what we're talking about. Obviously, not all Jews dress this way. You have conservative Jews that aren't the same as Orthodox Jews or Hasidic Jews. You have Reform Jews, and as that earlier statement said, there are even secular Jews that aren't really practicing religion in any way, that aren't much distinct from the culture other than that they have a kind of Jewish lineage ethnically and perhaps celebrate a couple of those holidays. Probably the biggest reaction to the modern world for Jews is Zionism. And in Zionism, the nation of Israel almost becomes the salvific figure. It's this idea of there's a people without a land, the Jews, for a land without a people, Palestine. The problem with that is it's not exactly true. When the Jews went back to Palestine, it was peopled with Muslim and Christian Arabs and some others, but mostly Muslim and Christian Arabs. Some Jews who had remained there for generations were still there, but this influx of European culture Jews into this kind of a nomadic lands with ancient traditions and claiming this is a land without a people, we're going to just set up house wherever we see empty land. It doesn't work that way in that region. And so Zionism is a real challenge in the modern world because a lot of Jews, even Jews who aren't necessarily all that religious, kind of see a homeland in Israel as the salvific reality because they can maintain their identity and avoid persecution if they can all come together and live together as a nation. So that's Zionism in a sense, in essence, as a religious movement, even for secular Zionists, because they see the land as the thing which will save them.